Hope that sticks. All right, so my name is Andy. I work at Status, and this talk is about making sure that we can get Ethereum to everyone and everywhere. And the question is, how do we actually do that? So at Status, we view ourselves as the mobile window onto Ethereum. This means that when you're sending messages through Status, you're talking directly with your friends. They're going directly over Whisper, which is a peer-to-peer, end-to-end encrypted dark messaging protocol that's part of the Ethereum stack. So whenever you're sending messages, that's going directly to other people without any servers in between it, and it's a radically different architecture to any other messenger that currently exists at the moment. But this is just the bare tip of the iceberg in terms of what we actually do, because we also have a native wallet. It means that you can transact seamlessly with anybody on Ethereum, and it's really the combination of private peer-to-peer messaging with a public, global, immutable ledger that allows us to think about and speak about conversational commerce on steroids. Because it's not only messaging in a wallet, but also the ability to interact with any DApp that exists on Ethereum at the moment. And this is really what I want to focus on in this talk, because it's really about these conversational and social spaces when we build this new decentralized architecture that we're all going to be using that are most important to understand, because they're going to be the most impactful in terms of building community and making this stuff sustainable for a long time. In order to understand exactly why this is important, we need to go over some history. So back in the early sort of 50s and 60s, before the computer had settled into kind of cultural significance as this solipsistic machine that you interact with on your own and you just sort of hack away on your own, there were radically different ideas of what actually constituted a computer at all, right? So it was certainly, there was this notion that a computer was more of a networked method of advancing collective knowledge and enabling collaboration on scales never before seen, and perhaps even as a means of enabling creativity rather than competition, and collaboration rather than mass surveillance, right? So these ideas come from a very, very long time ago. If you go back to 1737, there was a guy called Andrew Michael Ramsey who was a Freemason, and he was the first guy to begin speaking about something called the Universal Dictionary. And in Ramsey's imagination, the Universal Dictionary was this book that would contain pointers to all of the different knowledge in the world. And if you could do that, and if you could make it complete, you could basically generate a world brain, right? So that's these ideas get picked up by a guy called Charles Cutter, who is a library scientist, and he's the inventor of something called the Universal Decimal Classification System. He was a contemporary of Melville Dewey, and I don't know if there's any library scientists in the audience, but the Dewey Decimal System is what's used in libraries across the world. And these guys were thinking about how do we organize information long time before like we had computers or the digital world, anything that we know today in modernity. And at the same time as these guys were working on actual library classification systems, there were a whole bunch of science fiction writers, perhaps most famously a guy called H.G. Wells, who was also on the same trip of this hyper-connected superorganism that was capable of intelligence and computation on scales that we had never before seen, right? And he wrote a short story called The World Brain, in which he really explored that. And his ideas were then picked up by another guy called Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Jesuit priest, who was actually accused of heresy by the Catholic Church, because he sort of said that if we could implement these new ways of collecting and sharing information, we could actually generates a sort of divine consciousness with unfettered access to information. So this is what all these guys were actually thinking about and trying to build a long time before the computer got going in the 50s and 60s, really. So all of this led to a little-known but incredibly important figure in computer science. There's a guy called Paul Otlet. He was a Belgian information scientist. And he started in the late 19th century by building something called the Universal Bibliographic Repository, right? And basically what he did is he hired a whole bunch of people to read as many books as they can and then write down on key cards a summary of that book and then the keywords and all the other different pieces of knowledge that it connected to, and then had them stored in this massive bibliographical repository. And like he was the first guy to really say, you know, this universal book formed of all the books would become a kind of annex of the brain itself, right? A substrate for memory, ubiquitous and eternal. So it's kind of what Ramsey had been talking about, except Paul Otlet actually built it. Right? It was called the Mundaneum, and it existed in Belgium. It was funded by the League of Nations, right? Because they saw this advance of collective knowledge and the enablement of creative collaboration as a means of achieving and maintaining peace, which is a really interesting thing, particularly if you read The Sovereign Individual and think about the state of the world as it exists at the moment. So the key idea in all of this history was these guys were talking about the fact that you can have this sort of top-down classification of knowledge, but it's really, really important to combine that with a bottom-up social space. So while all these people were reading for Otlay's Mundaneum and sort of these experts labeling index cards and then storing them in the repository, you also had this notion of social space, so you could kind of track the different uses that any piece of content or any product or service had, and that would inform the context and the human meaning associated with that specific product, service, or content, right? So you have these auxiliary tables which existed below with like a plus or a slash or a colon, and each thing means different things. And this is the other key feature of this history, which has kind of been left out of the web as we experience it today, is that links themselves actually carry meaning. Right? So it's not just something that takes you from one place to another in this hyper-connected world of information. It actually signals agreement or disagreement, or it stakes some kind of value as you move through the web of hyper-connected information, which is really interesting. And that kind of brings us to the beginning of the modern history of the web, which starts in the 20th century with a guy called Vannevar Bush, who wrote an essay called As We May Think. And he proposed this machine called the Memex, and you can see a sort of schematic diagram of it over there. And basically, the Memex was built on microfilm because Bush had worked on microfilm in the war. And you would store all the books that you could on this microfilm, and then you kind of stand there with this really weird like device on your head, and you would call two books up at the same time, and then track your way through them and draw links and associations between the knowledge that you were working with. And the idea is that you would have this completely bottom-up, user-generated social space around information, and that the trails that people had made as they moved through that information would be visible to everybody else, right? It's this idea of modern-day marginalia. So I'm a literary and linguistics student, and we absolutely lose our minds for marginalia because it makes encountering a book such a radically different experience, right? When you read a book that has marginalia in it, you've got these like layers of knowledge that you can see as different minds have come to the book and left this like accretion of time in the knowledge that you're working with, which is really, really fascinating. And it leads to a radically different encounter with that knowledge. And it is kind of proof, as Carl Sagan said, that books and information are proof that humanity is capable of magic. So that's what all these guys are doing. And really the chief magician, the guy that I most love in this whole history, was a guy called Doug Engelbart, who worked at a place called Xerox PARC in the 60s. And he was one of the most prolific inventors of all time. He came up with something called NLS, which is the online system. He was the author of this thing called Augmenting Human Intelligence. It's an essay that you can get online, and I highly recommend it. And he was also the giver of something called the mother of all demos, which was something that he did in 1968, where in one demo in the 60s, he showed off a graphic user interface, a word processor, a mouse, and collaborative video calling all at once in 68, right? It is unreal. If you can go and find this demo on YouTube, I highly recommend it because it's so far ahead of its time. It's really quite crazy. And in fact, it's even sometimes, in some respects, ahead of what we have now, because particularly that video call that he did with a collaborator in Palo Alto was fundamentally collaborative, right? So they were sharing access to a shared document. You could see their cursors with their little initials below them and like co-editing it in real time through the video call, right? This wasn't like a shitty Google Hangouts where you have to do a screen share. This was literally like collaboration is built into the architecture of what Engelbart was working on. And it's really, really important because Engelbart was absolutely obsessed with like groups of people. And how do we like use these network computer systems to enable people to collaborate and share information, again, on scales never before imagined. And his sort of key question was, how can we allow people to operate in domains of complex information structures? And particularly, his answer to this was potentially to develop what he called the knowledge repository of all knowledge repositories, right? And this is why I told you about Andrew Ramsey and Paul Otley earlier, because it's exactly the same concept, just in a modern dialogue. Like if you have the knowledge repository, which has links to all the different knowledge repositories in the world and allows you to navigate that, it becomes, in essence, an annex of the brain itself, right? A universal book, ubiquitous and eternal, which is really interesting. So the last piece of history that then gets picked up by this particular strain of thought was a guy called Ted Nelson, who actually wasn't very technical himself, but he was an incredible writer, and he had a gift for coming up with words. So he was the guy who actually generated hypertext, and he came up with transclusion and hyperbooks and a whole bunch of stuff about information spaces and structures. And he proposed something called Xanadu, which has been called the best vaporware never written, which I feel like might appeal to people in this community, right? Even though he never implemented it, it did allow for people like Andy van Dam and various other computer scientists at the time to write what was called the hypertext editing system, and that led directly to the work that Sir Tim Berners-Lee was doing on HTTP and the web as we know it today. Right, I've left out a whole bunch of history and particularly the military-industrial context that a lot of this stuff happened in, but the question that I want to ask you based on all of this stuff is, what does Ethereum look like as an information space, and what can we build it to be? So, in order to answer that, just a quick summary of what the web that wasn't ready is. You have this notion of two-way classification with top-down classification with bottom-up social space. The notion of two-way linking, in which links carry actual meaning and signal agreement or disagreement or stake value. You've got the notion of visible paths through information and modern marginalia. Users must be equivalent to authors, right? To use these systems must be to author your way through them. And finally, and most importantly, conversational and social spaces must be a part of the architecture itself, right? So the web that wasn't is really a creative, collaborative conversation. And I want to kind of suggest to you guys that Bitcoin and Ethereum as information spaces enable conversations about value that would previously not even imaginable. And particularly Ethereum with this generalizable machinery and language that allows for the trustless execution of arbitrary code on some shared thing is a really, really interesting ontological framework in which to think about what conversation actually means in the modern world, particularly when it's so literally and closely tied to value itself. So just to sort of emphasize that, this trustless execution of arbitrary code on a global network capable of deterministic communication that's agreed upon by a set of peers allows us to forge languages that help communities practice. And perhaps even further than that, that require a certain kind of practice in order to be a part of the community at all, right? So the linguistic primitives that you use in order to enter these conversational and social spaces need to be of a certain form in order for you to be a part of the community at all. And don't get confused by the technical language that I'm forced to use there. Linguistic primitives are literally just the things that make up your language. So it's become socially acceptable when a friend asks me a question for me just to send a URL to a link to somewhere that has the full and complete information. And that's now an actual linguistic primitive that is part of our language, right? If you think about it for a little while, what the URL allows us to do as a linguistic primitive is to share more information more accurately than one mind can hold in conversational memory at one time, right? And this applies to everything like memes on Twitter, URLs, and if you extend that thinking into smart contracts and transactions, the possibilities for the kinds of conversations that are intimately and uniquely tied to value become really, really, really interesting. And we can start sort of thinking about bringing all of this work that Engelbart was doing with knowledge repositories and how you gather knowledge, how you inform that with social and conversational spaces around these sort of decentralized autonomous organizations that are made up of these creative individuals, and bring it all together into one thing. So what does that actually look like? Well, we've already got the top-down structure implied by the simple fact of blocks, and then sort of indirectly by the consensus algorithms that we use, and the hashes and the signatures and the various data structures that are suitable to our needs. And then we've already got that bottom-up social space, which is implied by the mere fact of transactions, right? So the type, kind, and frequency of transactions that you get involved with are indicative of the kind of social spaces that we can begin to think about building with these linguistic primitives. It gets even better, though, because Ethereum, like Gavin Wood said at DevCon 1, is a purely object-oriented environment in which you know always which object has sent you a message. So that allows us to do this notion of two-way linking fairly, fairly easily, and we can actually stake value onto links. So it's not just signaling agreement or disagreement, but you can actually stake 100 SNT or 100 ANT or 2 ETH onto links that you think strongly agree with your arguments and you want people to actually read. That would be nice. I write a lot of different articles, and I know people never follow the links. It would be nice to be able to signal, this is a really important link, read it. And then visible paths and modern marginalia are there because this is a public immutable ledger, and you can see always what people are doing. So a lot of this stuff is already in place. Users are already authors, right? When you use Ethereum, you author a new state, always, and that state is agreed upon by everybody around the world, which is really fascinating. I think that that's something that we can probably make more obvious to users through specific UX decisions, and that's going to come down to the designers in the room. And finally, this notion of conversational spaces, right? And they're aimed not at tracking or advertising, but exploring and mapping creativity and enabling collaboration at scales never before possible. What does that actually look like? Well, if you take a look at, this is CryptoKitties in status, and over here you've got a little chat icon at the bottom, and what tapping on that chat icon does is it takes you to a Whisper chat for CryptoKitties. This is a chat that actually exists on Whisper, and the topic is encrypted and gossiped around. So the topic is just CryptoKitties, and if you know anything about how Whisper works, it's gossiped around the whole network. So you don't need you don't need status to listen to the CryptoKitties unique chat on Whisper. It's just there as an inherent feature of the network. Anybody with any client that is listening to Whisper and filtering for that specific topic will be able to find it. And it means that CryptoKitties or Aragon or Gitcoin or whoever else has their own unique social conversational space as an inherent part of the architecture itself, right? It's really, really important that you realize that this is not just about status. Whisper is an inherent part of the Ethereum stack. It goes together with the EVM and Swarm. And as soon as we enable this kind of stuff to happen, all of a sudden you can have these unique architectural conversational spaces happening behind whatever your DApp is. That's obviously not enough, right? We need to actually be able to have useful things happening in that chat. We need to be able to prevent spam. We need to have, customer service methodologies. We need to be able to share knowledge. We need to be able to interact in valuable ways with each other that extend beyond just helping community members and showing them what to do. So if you look in the top right here, this is sort of how the stack currently looks at the moment in Status. You have Ethereum at the bottom, and then Status is this wallet, chat, and browser. And the browser allows you to access any DApp that exists. But that DApp is not native to Status, and if you give it a try now, Status is on mainnet, and you can take a look at it now. You'll see that it often takes really quite a long time to load any DApp because it's just happening in a web view, and so it's a really bad user experience, and we can't control that. So what we've done is we've built extensions which allow you to provide your own features directly within Status, right? So we wanted people to build DApps that have a native feeling. There should be no distinction between what is a Status feature and what is an extension. These things should be co-extensible, right? And extensions are so much more than just things that might help you in those chats, which form a sort of architecture of the social space. They're really all about kind of video streaming, better decentralized exchanges, custom asset screens, and perhaps, in fact, entire ephemeral DApps that are called into being, composed on your phone as you need them, and then fade away as you don't, right? And this is actually kind of what an extension looks like, and it's really quite important because it's a radically new and different concept. So we've got a little GIF here. Basically, we're in our profile, we're going to install an extension in Status by putting in a URL. At the moment, we're just using a GIST, but this would definitely be hosted in IPFS or Swarm. We've successfully installed it. If we now go to a chat, you'll see that if we type that command down there, we have another command that has been brought in by the extension. This is a collectible command, and this extension allows us to send CryptoKitties in chat, which is really quite remarkable, I think, and is sort of indicative of just how powerful this stuff can really be, right? Again, it's not just about chat, but this is the first place where we will see these kind of things having a huge effect, because what an extension is, it's just leveraging multiple hooks that are defined by the host and hook into specific components of Status. It's composed very simply of views, queries, and events, and all you need to do is specify what's called a .edn file, which is an extensible data notation. So this is just it's a universal data flow going between these queries, events, and views, and it's hosted somewhere in a decentralized storage provider, and you don't need to build it, right? You can just sort of specify it, install it in Status, and off you go. There's no build, there's no need to ship it through the App Store, there's no need to ship it through the Play Store. We really are escaping from a lot of these centralized solutions that force us to do things in specific ways. And what's even better is that a Status user can load it via their ENS username, and they have tight and granular control over which extensions they use, so that we can carry on ensuring security and privacy for our users. So that's all that I have time for today. Thanks so much for listening, and I just want to sort of encourage you guys to, the things that it is possible to conceive of with this technology and with these networks are nearly limitless, right? And the horizons of the possible stretch so much further than almost any of us can imagine. So, imagine, and let's get to work. Cool.